you just do it,
Hey.
it'll turn out okay. Finally, we're back to the science after politics and radio apps. We're back to the thing y'all love.
Glad you didn't bring me on for the politics, because, man, there's a reason I don't do that on my channel.
The reason I don't do it either.
Yeah.
But anyways, today we're talking about stupid short cord.
Talking about short cords, everybody. I hate them.
Today we're talking about dinosaurs, and I figured what better person to ask about dinosaurs than a dinosaur.
Yep, that's me. I'm a dinosaur. I'm Dapper Dinosaur. I feel like probably most of you will know who I am. I know, so we have Bent Hovind and Eric Gerthaler, who have both appeared on my channel, so they definitely know who I am. In fact, Bent Hovind, no relation, is, of course, my regular guest host. We will be doing our next episode of our regular show, Can't with Bent, tomorrow.
Oh, awesome. Yeah, I had been on my show a few weeks ago talking about his music career.
I know, I was there. That was a really fun stream. Actually, another person that you had on recently will also maybe be joining my stream, although probably not, because it's 100% goblin-free stream. So, you know.
Oh yeah. She sang a Christmas song.
Mm-hmm. But dinosaurs, though. So, what do you want to know about dinosaurs?
Well, I guess first of all, when did we discover that they existed?
So it's actually kind of a complicated question. There's reason to think that humans have been finding dinosaur bones for millennia. And the question then is, well, did they recognize them as dinosaurs the way we do now? And the answer is not really. And they had the idea that these were obviously the bones of creatures that had died. And some of them even recognized that the bones had since turned to stone and that this was not, just a normal bone lying about. But generally speaking, until fairly recently, the idea of extinction wasn't really a thing that people understood. People generally thought that either the Abrahamic God or various nature deities or just the spontaneous generative powers of nature would produce organisms such that they didn't always have to reproduce, biologically, and that this would keep essentially all types of creatures populated. Yeah. And so, generally speaking, until the idea of extinction really took hold, which wasn't until the 19th century, the idea of extinction didn't really occur to people. So people thought that these were creatures that must still exist somewhere, maybe not where they are, right? Because people recognize that, we don't have the same animals everywhere. So, like say the Romans had menageries and they brought in exotic animals to fight in gladiatorial arenas, specifically because they were exotic. So people have known for millennia that not everything exists everywhere, but the idea was if you found a bone, it had to be a thing that's somewhere.
Yeah. I know it's not dinosaurs, but I heard that people used to think that like mammoth or elephant skulls were like cyclops or something.
So it's not clear how true that legend is. The idea that, because, if you look at an elephant skull, there's one very obvious hole right in the center of the face, and it kind of looks like an eye socket. And unlike humans, who being, monkeys, basically, in common with all other monkeys, humans have, enclosed eye sockets. Whereas most other animals most other mammals, I should say, don't actually. Most mammals don't actually have a full ring of bone around their eye. They just have little arcs that come up essentially from the cheeks. I don't want to get too technical. But so it does kind of look like an eye, but we also don't have any real historical accounts of someone finding a skull, declaring it to be obviously some kind of giant one-eyed man, and then going with it. Although, interestingly, we do have an account from, I believe, the 17th century of someone finding, in fact, a dinosaur bone. It was a dinosaur femur. It was the distal end of the femur, and assuming that it was a petrified giant scrotum. Which it was not. It was, in fact, the distal end of a femur. But the distal end of a dinosaur femur has these two kind of globular bulges where the knee interface is, basically. And so it does kind of look like that. So, but when we really start recognizing that dinosaurs are a distinct thing is with the rise of actual paleontology and sort of an attempt to continue on the systematic classification of both modern and ancient organisms that was started by Carolus Linnaeus. And so the big names there would be like, well, obviously the biggest one is Sir Richard Owen, although he is it's kind of a dick, if I'm being honest. Sir Richard Owen was not a nice guy, but he is probably the person who did the most actual work classifying ancient organisms in a systematic way. Even though he was a bit dishonest, he was still actually very good at doing that. And yeah, it's kind of unfortunate that we have to credit so many taxa so the description of so many taxa to him. Because really, I'd rather not be him. But we also can't forget Mary Anning, who was an English paleontologist who was tragically under-recognized in her time, but she was the discoverer of a great many, especially marine fossils in England.
But she was a girl, and we don't give girls any credit.
So it was two things. One, she was a girl, and two, she was not from a wealthy or landed family. So even if she had been male, she still would have had an uphill fight, although she probably would have been recognized eventually. Unfortunately, being female, she was not, despite the fact that many of the people who were members of the Royal Society and who were writing papers on paleontology would regularly consult with her. I mean, they would correspond with her via letter or have meetings with her. How exactly was Richard Owen a jerk? Okay, so Richard Owen was a jerk in a number of ways. One, he was very willing to excoriate people who disagreed with him in fairly harsh for, mid to late 19th century terms in very open publications. Like he would write in newspapers or publications of the Royal Society, just excoriating people for disagreeing with him.
The blogosphere of yesteryear.
Basically. But the thing was, he was also willing to straight out lie about organisms to make his ideas sound right. So, for instance, he made up differences between humans and other apes in order to make it seem like humans weren't apes. He just invented parts of ape anatomy that just didn't actually exist. And it's just that for these reasons, humans could be easily separated from apes. He also never really accepted the fact that Archaeopteryx, after a specimen with the skull was found, actually had the skull that it did, because he had firmly predicted beforehand that it would have a normal bird skull with a beak and, the very long premaxilla with the relatively short maxilla and, all that stuff, the reduced temporal fenestrae, all that stuff. It was like, oh yeah, it'll just be a regular old bird skull. And then they find it, and it's basically the most dinosaur skull that's ever been around. So just basically dinosaur. But he is the one who came up with the word dinosauria. Before him, what we now think of as the two main groups of dinosaurs, Ornithischia and Saurischia, were recognized as groups of animals that were fundamentally similar in the same way that like mammals are fundamentally similar in many ways. But he realized that there were in fact various anatomical features that connected both Saurischia and Ornithischia. So he pointed to things like the shape of the fourth trochanter on the femur. There were a whole bunch of things like the perforate or extensively perforate acetabulum, which is the part of the hip where the femur sockets in. Things like that. The fused nature of the sacral vertebrae to the iliac crests and to each other. So he recognized that there were a lot of things that united this entire group of organisms. And so he called them terrible lizards, not because they're lizards, but because he knew that they were reptiles, because he was a good anatomist. And so one of the biggest things that you can use to tell a reptile from, say, a mammal is the number of bones in the jaw. So speaking of
lizard and stuff, you could tell, like, the way I think it's in the park. I think it's still in the London Park. His original versions of what dinosaurs look like.
Well, to be fair, those aren't just Richard Owen, although he probably wouldn't object too much to any of them. But if you go to or look for pictures of the Crystal Palace Park dinosaurs, it actually includes animals that aren't dinosaurs. It has some ichthyosaurs and some pterosaurs in there too, but they are, shall we say, wildly inaccurate. But even then, they still don't really look like lizards. So if you look at the iguanodons or the megalosaurs that are in there, those being the first two officially described dinosaurs, Megalosaurus and Iguanodon, they still have upright limb postures, and they're not sprawling. They are dragging their tails, and they're quadrupedal, which we know Iguanodon was mostly quadrupedal. It was probably able to run on two legs, but it's a little iffy. But Megalosaurus was definitely not bipedal. I just lost my train of thought. Yeah, those are pretty inaccurate. But he used the word lizard because he definitely knew that they were closer to reptilia. But the other thing is, when you're naming things in Greek and Latin, there's only so many words that convey reptile that you can possibly use. And the Greek word that roughly translates to lizard is one that has been used from that time and up until now to just describe broadly reptilian kind of things.
Kind of like how one of the whale ancestors is also a quote lizard name.
Yeah, Basilosaurus. It's Greek for king lizard or king of the lizards, and that's because it was originally misidentified. And that originally, when it was found, there was the idea that it might be a mosasaur, but then more of it was found, and everyone was like, "Oh no!" But that name had already been published. Yeah, and one of the rules is once a name is published, unless it's found to not actually be a valid taxon that you're describing, the name sticks.
It's there for life.
Right. There are some exceptions to that rule, but basically everyone, and I mean everyone, essentially has to forget the name for about 50 years and use a different name, and then the new name can stick. But that has happened very few times, although one of the most famous times was Tyrannosaurus Rex. Tyrannosaurus Rex's original name was not Tyrannosaurus Rex. It was much worse. I don't remember it, but it was lame. And trust me, we're all better off for having it be Tyrannosaurus Rex.
And it wasn't like one of those things, actually, another one like a Microraptor or something like that, it had a different name. They thought it was something else. And they think, oh, that's the time. But the time they discovered it was already named something else, it was too late.
Kind of. So Microraptor was named before most of the later finds that had the extensive integument structures, which is essentially just its feathers, because it had very well formed and well developed flight feathers. And so previously there had been the prediction that there might have been a four-winged stage in bird evolution. And this was for a number of reasons. One is that, actually the biggest reason is that if you look at a bird's feet, those scales that are on there, those are actually stunted feathers. They're feathers that basically just don't grow right. But certain mutations can actually get those feathers to grow back. And that was a common mutation that people liked to encourage in pigeon breeding because, it made, also in chickens too. And in both cases, it made, fluffy footed birds. But the interesting thing was the feathers, while they didn't really form a wing, they were asymmetrical like the flight feathers on the actual wings were. And so since by this time we'd already noticed that there was there were things like atavisms and ontogenetic similarities to the actual evolutionary timescale, or not timescale, but development of organisms. That while ontology didn't recapitulate phylogeny, they were related. You could reconstruct aspects of phylogeny through ontology. So those things together made people think that maybe there was a four-winged ancestor to modern birds. And the initial animal was proposed and called Tetrapteryx as a hypothetical, which means four wings. Unfortunately, it would have been nice if we could have called Microraptor Tetrapteryx, but when it was found, it was just at the time, relatively unremarkable, small velociraptorian dromaeosaur, and so no one really knew that it was so spectacularly feathered and in fact had four wings. So, oh well.
Also, off topic and stuff, but then we're talking this part, but then like calling it terrible lizard, I guess it made like some creations like one of your favorites, like Kent Hovind like
Mhm.
think that lizards actually grew up to be dinosaurs.
Yeah, it's okay. So the only way to think that dinosaurs are lizards is to know nothing about either group. You just it's really really wrong. So the number of skeletal differences between lizards and dinosaurs is almost too innumerable to count. I mean, you can start at one end of the animal and work your way to the other end, and you will just keep finding things like the lizards actually close off the. Oh, I want to say it's a superior temporal fenestra, but it might actually be the inferior, and I don't know off the top of my head. They have a parietal foramen. They entirely lack a antorbital foramen. I mean, they have pleurodont rather than thecodont teeth. There are characteristics of the occipital condyle in dinosaurs that don't occur in lizards. Lizards have sprawling limbs, whereas dinosaurs have, the upright limb posture more similar to mammals, at least superficially. The acetabulum of lizards isn't perforate. They entirely lack a caudofemoralis longus muscle and the attendant fourth trochanter on the femur. They have different numbers of toes. I mean, it's virtually everything about a dinosaur is different from everything about a lizard. There is virtually no similarity between them. They are about as different as any two animals could be while both still being reptiles. It's just not the case that anyone who knows anything about lizards could confuse the two, which is one of the reasons why Richard Owen created a new classification. He could have just said, oh, they're just lizards and put them into the already existing lizard taxon. But he didn't, and he didn't for good reason, because they're not lizards.
So at least he knew that much, I guess.
Oh, Richard Owen was a genius. I mean, he was a very, very smart man.
I was saying knew that much. I mean, at least he knew that much to like separate them at least a little bit.
Oh, actually, he separated them fairly significantly. The category of archosaurs was still not really well understood at the time, but he definitely had them as their own entire order inside the class Reptilia. So the only connection he would draw between lizards and dinosaurs was they were both reptiles, and that's as far as he would go. And of course, you got to remember that at this time, everyone was still very much using just the Linnaean taxa. People weren't even really doing like superfamily and subclass and whatnot.
Yeah, it was still the basic 7, not the 300 we have today.
Well, at this point now, most taxonomists are just basically being like that. There's no point in worrying about whether something's an order or family or whatever. We have clades and we give them names, and who cares what the quote unquote rank is? Because the ranks are fundamentally arbitrary. There's no reason to say that this is a family and that's a superfamily. I mean, you could just say they're all one family, and then what used to be a family is now a subfamily. In fact, that happened recently with Geconidae. So it used to be that Geconidae included the Geconinae and Eublepharinae. But now Gecoda is now a superfamily. This happened in like the last couple of years, and Eublepharidae and Geconidae are now different families. And like, I just found that out recently, and I was like, well, that's new. Thanks for changing everything, guys.
Yeah, especially when we thought was two similar, two side-by-side families were actually a family inside of a family.
Well, yeah, but the thing is, what is a family? It's just a group of similar genus, or actually you can say it's a group of similar subfamilies. What's a subfamily? It's just a group of similar genera. Yeah. What's a genus? It's a group of similar species. Down until species, there's no actual definition. You can just call whatever group, whatever rank that you want. Like as long as you keep the nested hierarchy with the same shape of nesting that is actually borne out by the data, what rank you put a particular clade at is meaningless. So.
Hi, Maya.
Okay, Kenny Hornickson says, on a question, and I would like an honest answer. Do dinosaurs disprove the Bible? I don't think so. I mean, there are certainly some interpretations of the Bible that are incompatible with the evidence that we get from paleontology, geology, biogeography, essentially most of science.
But actually, sorry to interrupt you real fast, but speaking of dinosaurs in the Bible, you know how they say dinosaurs were on the ark and they're in the flood? At least Ken Ham does. Well, if you imagine the flood was a real thing, right? Pretend it was real.
Okay.
In the things, in the chapters, I forget what chapter it was, but you know how Noah released a dove to find the olive branch thing?
Yep, and he released a raven too.
Yeah, dove and ravens are birds. Birds are dinosaurs, so dinosaurs were on the ark.
Yeah, I mean that is true. The story does actually name 2 dinosaur species as being on the ark. But yeah, so paleontology just kind of wrecks the entire flood narrative as a real thing. In fact, it's not the only thing it does. Basically, all of reality says that no, there was never a giant flood that covered the entire Earth. But you don't have to interpret the Bible in a way that requires that to have been a literal event. And in fact, most Christians don't. Most Christians do not believe that there was a literal flood of Noah, at least not in the sense of a global deluge that covered the entire Earth. Because
maybe just a local area thing.
Maybe. I mean, there's a lot of different interpretations that you can go with that are reasonably consistent with Christianity or Judaism, or Islam for that matter, since Islam tends to share a lot of those stories, including Noah.
So back to the animals again. So I guess dinosaurs' journeys start back in the thing where they split from us in the amniote division.
Yeah, so the most recent common ancestor between dinosaurs and, say, mammals would in fact be the common ancestor of all of Amniota. And so the biggest split in Amniota is between Sauropsida on one side and Synapsids on the other side. And Sauropsida is more or less what we now would call reptiles.
It's funny. For the longest time, I thought the split was synapses and diapsids, but diapsids technically aren't clade until later on. Yeah.
So one of the problems there is that we have these groups that were called anapsids and euryapsids, and it wasn't clear for a while, just because we didn't have enough data, exactly how they were related to other amniotes. It turns out that they actually nest closer to diapsids than any of them do to synapsids. And also, many of the animals that we thought formed clades, like Anapsida or Euryapsida, don't actually form clades. They're actually essentially sauropsids with varying and convergently evolved skull conditions. So basically, a whole bunch of animals that we thought were basal to the reptile-mammal split, or might have been on one side or the other, actually ended up being on the reptile side. And that ends up being Sauropsida. But dinosaurs are, in fact, also diapsids, which means that they characteristically have 2 holes behind the eyeballs that are used primarily for jaw muscle attachment. And then within diapsids, the major divide, and this is, I'm skipping over a whole bunch of intermediary obscure clades, but basically the big divide is between archosaurs and lepidosaurs. On the lepidosauр side, we have things like lizards, sphenodons,
snakes.
Well, snakes are lizards.
Yeah.
We've also got some things like ichthyosaurs.
And plesiosaurs?
No, plesiosaurs are actually closer to the archosaur side.
Learned something new today.
Yep. Well, at least that's the current. That's generally the current consensus. It's still a bit of an open question, but there's a fair few things that push them towards the archosaur side. One of them just being the plesiosaurs are actually stem turtles. They're actually more closely related to turtles than any other living thing. And most genetic studies are recovering turtles as closer to archosaurs than lepidosaurs. And also, another big one is that, like archosauromorphs before them, plesiosaurs have thecodont teeth, which means the teeth are set in sockets.
So, like,
unlike lepidosaur teeth, which were generally pleurodire.
Yeah, I remember when people people thought that turtles were they used to think that turtles were the anapsid branch or something.
Yeah, it turns out nope. Turtles are in fact diapsids that have convergently lost the two temporal fenestrae.
Kind of like how we did almost.
Well, kind of. So your zygomatic arch is essentially made of this. It is in fact made of the same bones that the temporal fenestra of synapsids was made of. It doesn't open into an interior cavity of the skull. Instead, it's sort of like that opening has been kind of like shoved sideways, and yeah, it's a bit weird. But what are you gonna do?
Yeah.
So then, Archosaurus splits primarily into Pseudosuchia and Ava metatarsalia, with dinosaurs being on the Ava metatarsalian side, and crocodiles and alligators and their relatives on the other side. And then from there, pterosaurs branch off and dinosaurs branch off.
Yeah, they split off the pterosaurs next, and they got to the air first.
Well, I mean, after insects.
Oh yeah,
but they were the first. They were the first vertebrates to fly. Next, of course, being dinosaurs in the form of birds and various relatives of birds, and then finally the mammals got into the bunch sometime in the late Cretaceous.
We like latecomers.
I mean, to be fair, birds didn't really start to dominate until sort of. There's no middle Cretaceous, but like. You know what I mean when I say like in the middle of the Cretaceous. It's not a formal period, but like, late early to early late Cretaceous. That's really when the birds really start dominating the skies. And one of the reasons, though, that bats managed to do so well, because you got to remember, bats are one of the most successful groups of mammals. There are bats essentially every continent except Antarctica. They're on almost every island. And some islands, until humans got there, they were basically the only mammals. And so they're so successful because they're primarily nocturnal, whereas birds are primarily diurnal. And this is actually a pretty long-standing split between mammal and dinosaur behavior. For most of Earth's history, that since it's had both mammals and dinosaurs were much more dominant during the day, and mammals were much more prominent during the nighttime. And that's one of the reasons why dinosaurs, well, modern birds, even ones that don't really need it, all tend to have pretty good color vision, whereas most mammals either have no color vision or are dichromats, like dogs.
Yeah, we mentioned this a few months ago during the Paleozoic insect race episode, but both pterosaurs, dinosaur birds, and bat mammals had to modify their arms to become wings, for the insects didn't have that issue. At least most of them didn't.
Yeah. So with evolution, you're always kind of stuck with whatever your ancestors had, and you have to do something with it. And even in cases where it looks like we're evolving entirely new structures, like arms and legs out of like a wormy body, if you actually look into the genes and the embryology and whatnot, you'll actually find that the beginnings of arms are already present in the genetic structure of very primitive chordates like Amphioxus and things like that. And so you really are stuck with whatever your ancestors had. And so when it comes to tetrapods, it's like, okay, well, what are you going to fly with? Well, some lizards have managed to do a little bit of gliding by flattening out their rib cage, but that's not really going to get you powered flight because there aren't a whole lot of strong muscles attached there. You could try using your legs, but then the more specialized legs get for locomotion, the worse they are at locomoting on the ground. And that's pretty important to be able to move around on the ground. You don't have to be great at it necessarily, but you've got to be at least competent at it. And so basically that leaves the forearms. And so it's one of those things where like there really isn't another option. But one of the interesting things is that the way that every tetrapod group that has evolved flight has done it has been wildly different. So in all cases, it uses the fingers as a big supporting part of whatever the flight surface is. But in pterosaurs, we're using digit 4, your ring finger. Some people call it a pinky finger, but pterosaurs don't actually have that many fingers. So, and it's hugely elongating it and making this really complex system of intercrossing supportive tissues and collagen fibers and muscles and really quite a complicated membrane, all just hanging off of one finger, and then still using those limbs for locomotion on the ground, which is why the sort of the proximal end of that finger remains really robust, and the hand itself, like the metacarpals and whatnot, still remain pretty solid part of the animal's anatomy. It's because that was weight bearing, and it's also they were taking off primarily with their forelimbs. They weren't jumping with their legs like birds are. And then you get bats who do a four-limbed takeoff, and they have each finger has a patagium, which is relatively simple compared to a pterosaur's, but they're stretching it up between all the fingers. And then dinosaurs, having already evolved feathers, use them for the airfoil, and then to help keep the airfoil relatively stable, they fuse the fingers into a nice, solid, clubby hand thing. And so that's this kind of convergent evolution where we all have we all have the same problem to solve, and so we come to superficially similar answers. But because evolution is contingent and not repeatable and doesn't have foresight, the actual end is always different.
Oh, also off topic. Where did your channel's protector Godzilla branch off from?
So I'm actually going to go a bit controversial with this one, although I do happen to know that Aaron Ra tends to agree with me on this one. I actually think that Godzilla is probably a therapsid, which is a relatively derived member of the synapsids, which means he's actually much closer to a mammal. And I base this off the fact that he seems to have heterodont teeth. So he tends to have like canine teeth and incisors, and then some kind of post-canine teeth. They're not really differentiated into like premolars or molars, but like they're not the same as the incisors or the canines. He also tends to have ears in a lot of incarnations. Like yesterday I saw Godzilla 2000, the first of the Millennium series Godzilla films. And he has very prominent ears in that. But even if you go back into most of his Showa incarnations, especially Shodai Goji, the Godzilla suit in the first Godzilla movie, you get little ears poking out. And then in the Millennium series about Mechagodzilla, the Kiryu saga, starting with Godzilla against Mechagodzilla, you actually do see a skull of Godzilla, which is supposed to be the skull of the original Godzilla, even though the sizes don't match up between those movies. But retcon that a little bit. But in that, you actually see that Godzilla has the characteristic dentary squamosal jaw joint rather than a articular quadrate jaw joint like most reptiles do. And basically, the only things that have a dentary squamosal jaw joint are very derived therapsids, so very close to mammals. So yeah, I'm going to go ahead and say that Godzilla is much more mammal than he is any kind of reptile, as he's portrayed in most of his depictions in the Japanese Godzilla movies. Now, if you go to Shin Godzilla, who knows? It's a crazy fish monster radiation thing that evolves constantly. So, I mean, all bets are off with Shin Godzilla. But if you go to the American Godzilla from Godzilla 2014 and Godzilla, King of the Monsters, the legendary MonsterVerse Godzilla, they actually have produced skeletal drawings, and in that he actually looks much more like an archosaur.
Yeah.
But his feet don't work like a dinosaur's foot. They actually work much more like a poposaur or something like that. So much more of a pseudosuchian. So I think the Godzilla from the MonsterVerse is probably some kind of pseudosuchian with very derived feet in order to help it stand. Yeah. But you look at that skull, and it's very classical basal archosaur.
Is it true that no one talks about the 98 version?
I don't know what you mean. Eric says, did dinosaurs roar? The research I did indicated no. Yeah, probably not. So roars are a very distinct mammal sound, and the mammal hyoid bone is relatively strange in order to accommodate it in the animals that do roar. I'm sure that dinosaurs made threatening calls that were easily audible to their rivals. But it's probably much more like the sounds that you're getting from birds or alligators. So you could probably get hisses, screeches,
tweets,
rumbles, maybe some tweets. Yeah. I mean, tweets are usually not a threatening behavior. They're usually a social interaction thing, often a mate-seeking behavior. So if we're talking about like territorial, like sounds to establish territory or to threaten rivals, that probably would have been much more to do with things like deep rumbling, sort of an infrasound sort of thing that you got going there, or sort of screeches like you might get in like an angry bird who's not happy with you.
Anyways, speaking of dinosaurs and mammals, before we get to the actual clade, there's these things called like dinoforms and dinomorphs, dinosaur morphs, dinosaur forms.
Yeah, so those are basically organisms that are closer to dinosaurs than they are to anything else. And if most people were to see one, they would simply declare that it's a dinosaur, because for most practical purposes, you couldn't really tell the difference. In fact, if you were to time travel back to the late Permian and look at the actual dinosaurs like Coelophysis and dinosaur morphs well, I can't say Lagurpiton anymore because that's not, so I guess I'll go Lagosuchus. So in case you didn't know, Lagurpiton was recently discovered to in fact not be a stem dinosaur, but to in fact be a dinosaur morph, but actually to be on the pterosaur side of the split. So it's actually a closer relative of pterosaurs than dinosaurs. So, but anyway, we'll go with like Lagosuchus or something like that. And you were to look at those two animals, you wouldn't readily be able to say that they're completely distinct, and this is totally not a dinosaur, and this one totally is. And that's because at the time, actual dinosaurs were barely distinguishable from their not quite dinosaur relatives, which is how this is sort of the thing you expect with evolution, right? As time goes forward, things get more and more distinct because they diverge more and more because they're no longer mixing their genes.
Yeah, Erica brought that up too when we were talking about the primate migration. That the primate, the clade between primates and primate morphs was like very blurry.
Mm-hmm, yeah, it always is when you get down to the base of these trees. It's like I remember I've read some things about people who do parasodactyl research in the very early eras where parasodactyls are first diverging away from artiodactyls. And it's very frustrating because basically only tiny differences in the shapes of the molars can be used to distinguish rhinoceroses from horses. And I'm using these terms kind of loosely, like equids from rhinocerotids. I think that's the right word, whatever. Actually, there's rhinoceridia, so rhinocerids. So, but yeah, it's very tiny. If you look at the whole animal, basically at the time, a horse and a rhino would basically just be the same thing. They're just eating a slightly different diet. And the same thing is true for the earliest proboscids, like the elephants, and the early Sirenians, or the dugongs and manatees and whatnot. Their very earliest members are almost indistinguishable. How disappointed are you that we don't really know how dinosaurs sounded or how they socialized? I mean, it would certainly be great to know, but it's one of those things where I'm happy with how much we're learning right now. And so I tend to focus on the new stuff that we're learning and not so much the stuff that would be cool, but it's not likely that we're going to find out anytime soon. So I can't say I'm disappointed. I would be excited if we found stuff about that. Oh, and we do actually have some socialization information. Like we have collective nests, and we have trackways that indicate herding behavior in certain organisms. So we know a little bit. And also, of course, it's not clear how much we can generalize bird vocalizations into Dinosauria, but it's something, right? At least some non-avian dinosaurs probably had vocalizations that were more or less like birds. And of course, the other thing is we also don't know much about the early vocalizations of Pseudotsuchians. So the other template that we have are alligators and crocodiles and caimans and gharials and whatnot. But we're not sure, are their vocal structures more derived or more basal compared to those of birds? And the answer is, I don't know. It's probably less derived than birds because bird syrinxes, which is what they use to vocalize, are very, very unusual as if you survey, tetrapods in general, whereas alligators and crocodiles, not so much. But that could be a thing that was sort of a it convergently went to a more basal seeming condition, like maybe. So the chances are that most dinosaurs had a sort of cross between crocodile type sounds and then a little bit on the birdie side, but probably not as complicated as actual modern birds could do. Like they probably couldn't be singing a really complicated song like, modern passerine songbirds.
Yeah. But off topic, but Eric's question made a good point of the past dinosaurs thing where people used to think in the past, when people used to think dinosaurs were totally different than what they really are. I used to read books from the 80s where they talk about that dinosaurs were slow and stuff. And also Jurassic Park, made dinosaurs more famous, I guess. They also brought up a lot of misconceptions about dinosaurs too.
Yeah. Well, I want to. So real quick, I'll just answer this question that's on screen here. T-Rex will almost certainly win. I usually give it to the higher mass dinosaur, but Spinosaurus jaws were not for fighting large land animals. So, whereas T-Rex jaws were. So normally I would say whatever animal had the higher mass is just probably going to win. But this is one of the few exceptions. T-Rex is probably going to win against Spinosaurus. Sorry, Jurassic Park 3. But I'm sorry, what was your question earlier?
Oh, but like how books and movies and stuff.
Oh, right. So around the 80s, there's this animal called Deinonychus is uncovered. And it's actually the animal that the velociraptors are based on in Jurassic Park. Deinonychus is just not as cool a name as Velociraptor, but if you actually look at the the Deinonychus skeleton, it's much more similar to the animals in Jurassic Park than a Velociraptor's skeleton is. And so they're basically just scaled up Deinonychus. But it was the people who discovered it just looked at the skeleton, and it was this very leggy animal, and in particular, it had very long metatarsal bones. And those are the bones that go from your heel to the base of your toes, and run along the length of your foot, kind of. And one of the things that you can do in modern animals that walk on their toes, this is called digitigrade, is the longer the metatarsals are compared to the fibula and the tibia, or the tibula, if you're Nephilim free, who doesn't know anatomy well enough to not know that there's tibula isn't a thing. So the shorter the tibia and the fibula are compared to the metatarsals, which are then longer, the more likely it is that this is an animal that can sprint really fast. And so Velociraptor had the proportions of a sprinter. Like this was not a slow plodding lizard-like animal. And it had these front claws that were great for grasping and clutching and bringing prey into the chest. And it was very clear that this was an active animal that was running around Mongolia. Or not Mongolia, sorry, Deinonychus is, I'm still thinking Velociraptor. Deinonychus is North America. So running around North America, which is another reason why, by the way, they find the Velociraptor in Montana. It's because, again, Velociraptors in Jurassic Park are actually Deinonychus, which is why you can find one in Montana. But anyway, so yeah, this was clear that this was really just running fast and very active. And so this kicked off this new idea about dinosaurs in the 80s, and it was called the Dinosaur Revolution, where we realized that dinosaurs were not plodding, cold-blooded things that had more in common with an alligator than they would have with, an eagle. And so Michael Crichton took all of that information in to some degree. I mean, he got some things wrong, both accidentally and deliberately in his book. As well as some things that he just made up that I can't say are wrong. Like in the book Jurassic Park, Dilophosaurus doesn't spit, but it has a venomous bite. And I can't say that it didn't have a venomous bite. I mean, it's not clear how we could know from the fossils. So maybe it did. I don't know. And then, Jurassic Park, the movie in the 90s, basically brought everyone the cutting edge paleontology of the 80s. But then it just kind of stagnated as a franchise. It didn't really go anywhere. And so now paleontology has largely moved on. And for a while, it was taking the public a really long time to catch up with more modern paleo art. But now I think that enough books have been using more accurate reconstructions that I think most people realize now that, Velociraptor looked more like an eagle than it did like a lizard. That basically the animal probably weren't so shrink wrapped.
Yeah, probably a little smaller than they were in the thing.
Yeah, so I think the public perception is slowly catching up, and apparently in the next Jurassic World franchise movie, a different company will be also producing dinosaurs, and they will be producing dinosaurs that were much more authentic, if you will. So apparently we're going to be seeing some more fully feathered dinosaurs from a different company in Jurassic World. What's it called? Dominion or something like that.
Is that the one where the dinosaurs are now with us in the real world?
Yeah.
The last movie, like that little clone girl released them out into the wild.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Also, if you could bring up Scott Duke's question, I think I want to talk about that. So, which dinosaurs should be featured in movies that are right now being overlooked? So, I honestly think that basically you could name anything that isn't prominent in movies, because the movie dinosaurs, we all know which ones they are. Right now, it's T-Rex, Velociraptor, Stegosaurus, Triceratops, and Brachiosaurus, and that's about it. But like, there's a bunch of other cool animals out there, like
your version.
Well, yeah, Tyrannosaurus is in Jurassic Park. It's in one scene. It is not a very accurate rendition. Not that my Ceratosaurus is the most accurate, but it's a lot better than Jurassic Park. But I'd like to see some more Ceratosaurus. I'd also like to see some Titanosaurs, like Titanosaurus or Argentinosaurus or Alamosaurus, which, despite being found in Texas, wasn't named for the Alamo, and that still bothers me to this day. So some Titanosaurs would be fun. Also, I think we're missing out on just the amazing cuteness of the Alvarezsaurids, because they're these relatively small dinosaurs that specialize on eating ants and termites, and they generally only have one claw, and they're just adorable. Like, have you ever seen an aardwolf? An aardwolf is technically, it's a hyena, but it's also one of the cutest animals you're ever going to find. And part of that is because it's a tiny hyena that specializes in eating ants and termites. And basically, Alvarezsaurids were just the aardwolves of dinosaurs. And they're adorable, and I want them to be in more stuff. I also think that pterosaurs are given really bad treatments in movies. They're almost never fluffy. They should be fluffy. They should be covered in pycnofibers, which are similar to protofeathers. They might be protofeathers. It's a little bit unclear.
Maybe they're protofeathers.
I mean, I would just call that a protofeather, but it's just not clear if there's a homologous filamentous integumentary structure between pycnofibers or like an ancestral one between pycnofibers and protofeathers. So maybe they are, maybe they're not.
Is that like down on the baby bird?
It's similar to down, although down has multiple strands that come off of a single follicle, and pycnofibers seem to be a single strand per follicle sort of thing. But they do have distally branching bits, which is similar to stage 2 protofeathers. So it's one of those things where like we need more data. We need a lot more because it's not clear right now. But yeah, so now I know that this is technically not dinosaurs, but I'm going with sort of like archosaurs in general need more love in movies. So like I would like to see more accurate pterosaurs. No perching on their hind feet. Stop doing that. Pterosaurs couldn't do that. So have them with pycnofibers. Stop giving pteranodon teeth. The name literally means toothless wing. And then you put teeth in it. Like, come on. I'd like to see some other pterosaurs in there, like Quetzalcoatlus or other asdarchids. Like, any of them really. But Quetzalcoatlus is probably one of the coolest. So yeah. And then maybe some other like let's get some thalassodromids in there or something, right? Because there's a lot of really cool pterosaurs that just get no love in movies and TV. Or pterodastro, like the filter feeding flamingo pterosaur that might have even actually been pink for the same reason that flamingos are pink, because they ate the same diet. Yeah, I would love to see a pink pterodastro like just sitting there as a background creature in a Jurassic World movie, just hanging out next to some flamingos filter feeding some krill out of the brackish water in an estuary. That'd be cool.
Well, because of the Archosaur brands, basically on the pterosaur, at least it might be on the crocodile side too, but thinking mainly of the pterosaurs and dinosaur brands, via natural selection, somehow they started doing a two-legged thing instead of a four-legged thing.
Well, so the propensity for hind limb dominant movement actually goes back pretty far into the base of Archosaur. So one of the most basal Archosaurs is Euparkeria. And it's so basal that it's not clear if it's Pseudotsuchian or not. It probably is-ish, but it's very basal. And even at that point, while it was probably a quadruped most of the time, it could at least run on two legs. We have really good reason to think that it could. And many of what were formerly thought to be quadrupedal rausuchids actually turned out to be at least facultative bipeds, which means they could walk on two legs if they needed to. And many more of them actually were probably habitual bipeds, which means that their typical stance is on just two legs. So this tendency towards bipedalism is actually very, very early in Archosaur lines. And you can even see it just with the muscle attachments on the hind legs. They're always much more substantial on the hind limbs than they are on the front limbs. Now, this is not unusual. Many animals are hind leg dominant. Many mammals are hind leg dominant when it comes to locomotion. But also, Archosaurs had heavily muscled tails, which helped pull the center of balance back towards the knees rather than being up in the torso, which also helps. So it's really not just that dinosaurs went two-legged. A lot of Archosaurs went two-legged, and then many of the ones that were two-legged, other than dinosaurs and pterosaurs, ended up kind of going away.
But then like how some lizards and mammals return to the sea, got their sea legs back. Some of the dinosaurs got their front legs back.
They did, although it's interesting because you can tell that is not that they are descended from bipedal organisms. So, for instance, now this isn't easy to do because people usually get dinosaur feet wrong. But if you look at either a skeleton of like a Triceratops or another ceratopsian, or a really good reconstruction, it has to be really good, you'll actually notice that like the feet don't actually face forward the way that a mammal's would. They're actually kind of off to the side so that the palms face each other a little bit. And the lateral digits, so, digits, like 3 and 4 and whatnot, are way off to the side. And they tend not to have claws because they're so off center that they're not really supporting any weight. And then you get other things like front digits were such a hassle for sauropods that eventually sauropods just lost all of the digit bones. And so they were just walking on a fleshy pad on their metacarpals. And they just don't even bother with phalanges. Forget phalanges, and except for the thumb, because they had a little spike there. And in fact, even really late sauropods like the titanosaurs that I mentioned, they lost even that little thumb spike. So yeah, even the quadruped dinosaurs, like, because they're descended from bipedal ancestors, the way that they walk on all fours is weird and kind of stupid, if I'm being honest.
It's like if humans went back to being bipedal. I mean, not bipedal, I mean quadrupedal.
Yeah, it would require a lot of weird changes, and we would probably not be very good at it for quite a long time. So let's see, we got from Eric. Why is it that YEC do sermons on dinosaurs when old Earth creationists and theistic evolutionists don't? When you type in dinosaurs and the Bible on YouTube, you you get YEC propaganda. It's because in order for YEC to be true, they need to explain the apparent lack of non-avian dinosaurs in the Bible. And so they just make up things about them. Whereas when you get to old Earth creationists or theistic evolutionists, I mean, there's nothing for them to explain. Why aren't animals like, Brachiosaurus or T-Rex in the Bible? Because they were already extinct by the time the Bible was written and had been for billions of years. It's that simple. There's no reason for them to talk about dinosaurs in the Bible any more than there is for them to talk about trilobites in the Bible. There's just no reason to expect dinosaurs to be in the Bible. In fact, when it comes to non-avian dinosaurs, there's no reason to expect them to be in most books. I mean, what cities in the contiguous U.S. have the best dino displays? So I can't say for certain because I haven't been everywhere, but the museum in Houston has an excellent paleontology wing. It has, I think it has like 3 Triceratops and 2 T-Rexes, and it has a Deinonychus, and it's also got a lot of great non-dinosaurs. And basically, as you follow it through from the entrance, as it kind of swoops around, you go through the entire Phanerozoic, and even a little bit of the Archaeozoic, the little late bits of the Archaeozoic. So I would highly recommend Houston. The Museum in Colorado is pretty good. It's got an Allosaurus, it's got a Stegosaurus, it's got a nice Ceratosaurus skeleton, or not skeleton, sculpture outside near the parking lot. It's got a very, very nice Brachiosaurus mount. That's pretty impressive. It's also got some nice displays about muscle reconstructions and the evolutionary relationships with various dinosaurs and things like that. It's also got a few inaccuracies, like it's still got a Stygimoloch reconstruction labeled as Stygimoloch, even though that's now a junior synonym for Pachycephalosaurus. But it's still a very nice reconstruction, and I don't find any faults with it other than the labeling. I mean, it's still a good juvenile Pachycephalosaurus. Yeah, so that's pretty nice. The Museum of Science in Boston it's pretty good. It's got I would say recently, but it was like probably like 15 years ago, but updated T-Rex model. I believe it has a Triceratops. It's pretty good, and a few other smaller dinosaurs. I don't remember. I know that there's a museum in Phoenix that has what most people would call Tarbosaurus, but they have it labeled as a Tyrannosaurus, which is not wrong. It's just not typical. There is still an open question as to whether or not Tarbosaurus is really a valid genus. But it also has a Triceratops. It has a Protoceratops. It has some Iguanodontian. I don't remember which one. But it also has a Quetzalcoatlus, some reconstructions of Pteranodon sternbergi, not Longiceps. So not the Pteranodon you're probably used to, but it is Pteranodon. It has some Ornithochirids. I don't remember the exact genus, but it also has some replicas of the Berlin specimen of Archaeopteryx, as well as the type specimen, the holotype for Pterodactylus, if you like that. It also has a Camarasaurus mount and a Camarasaurus femur that you can actually touch. That's the actual fossil. So there's that. Let's see. I think that might actually sum up pretty much all of the big. Well, of course, there's the Smithsonian, right? It goes without saying, the Smithsonian is amazing. I don't remember exactly what's in there, and probably because it's changed since I was there. I haven't been there since.
Yeah.
I haven't been there in probably 17, 18 years. So I mean,
well, at least you've been there sooner than I have. Last time I was there, it was November of '93.
Oh yeah, I was there a few years after that. So
8th grade Washington trip.
I think I might have been there. Actually, it might be 20 years ago now, because it was probably somewhere around 2000, 2001.
Yeah. Oh, funny story about that. Off topic. Funny story about that. When 8th grade trip, we were at the Vietnam Memorial at the time. I was watching the thing. I saw class leave, so I saw class leave, so I started following them around. Started leaving with them, and after 2-3 minutes, I realized, wait a minute, I don't know anybody. I don't know any of these people in the group.
Oh man, yeah. So the Smithsonian, of course, is amazing. Now, if you want to go a little bit outside of the contiguous United States, the museum in Vancouver is excellent. Although I actually really like its Pleistocene displays. It's a really nice woolly mammoth and whatnot. And of course, I don't remember what the museum is called, but there's a museum that has Black Beauty, and that's, I think, in Alberta. So if you're willing to go into, like British Columbia or Alberta, head off to Canada, which, granted, you can't right now if you're in the United States because of horrible, horrible, horrible events. But yeah, eventually, I imagine that border will open up again, and Americans will once again be able to travel into the Great White North. But yeah, there's some great Canadian museums. And of course, the British Museum, if you want to go even farther afield, has really great displays. It has some very famous mounts, although some mounts are historical and so have not been updated in a very long time. So take some of the older mounts in the museum with a whole heaping of salt. And then Ian Chen says, have you heard of the Thesaurus? It's a dinosaur with an extensive vocabulary. I have heard of that.
But because so are are dinosaurs still considered the two main branches of what we call bird and lizard hip, or is it more complex than that now?
Maybe. So a few years ago, a rather controversial paper was published proposing that Ornithischia was a valid taxon, but that Saurischia was not, and that in fact theropods formed a clade with ornithischians called Ornithoscelida. Sorry, I always mispronounce that one. And that sauropods actually were a basally branching group that branched off before that. Now, this has been controversial, and it has met with mixed support from other studies that attempted to reproduce these findings. So it's not clear that Ornithoscelida is actually the way that paleontology is going to shake out in the end. I personally am skeptical, mostly because for a very long time, basically everything that we've been finding has been confirming Saurischia and Ornithischia as reasonably close related groups, especially if you look at very, very, very basal prosauropods, or sauropodomorphs, if you will, like Plateosaurus or even earlier things. They look a lot like theropods. But then again, the problem there is that theropods look a lot like just basal dinosaur. So that's part of the problem there. But I'm not saying that Ornithoscelida is not, that hypothesis is wrong. But right now, I don't think it's sufficiently supported that it's time to abandon Ornithischia and Saurischia as the common terms that we're going to use. Basically, I don't tend to discuss Ornithoscelida with people who aren't really big dino nerds, because you're not going to find it in most books. It's going to be confusing for most people, and it has yet to really overturn the previous consensus, although it might. And you know what? If it does, great. Although if it does technically mean that under current definitions, sauropods would no longer be dinosaurs. So
Would they be like that? Would they be in the dinosaur morph or dinosaur form category still, or?
Yeah, I believe they would be in the dinosaur morph. Although, don't quote me on that.
Yeah, but yeah, science is weird like that. I always thought it was weird, funny that bird dinosaurs came from the lizard hip. Not they came from the bird hip side. They came from the lizard hip side.
Well, I do think it's important to, if you look at the hips of the quote unquote bird hipped dinosaurs, they don't actually look that much like the hips of birds. Basically, the reason that they were called bird hipped is because, like modern birds, both the ischium and the ilium project posteriorly. But birds have extremely unusual pelvises. But the other thing is, as you look at theropods getting closer and closer to birds, so things like, Deinonychosauria, so that would be the troodontids and the dromaeosaurs, they're having pelvises that are pointing, like the ischium is either pointing pretty much directly down, or it's slightly tilted towards the back. And you get closer and closer to, like, Paravian dinosaurs, and you get ischial projections that are farther and farther backwards until you get to the point where you get to some of the basal birds, and they're pointing backwards pretty much parallel with the ilium. And then eventually you get to the point where the ischial projections actually start to separate from the middle line to help with the laying of relatively large and hard eggs, large compared to body size. And then, they get to sort of the modern condition where the ischial projections just kind of go posterior, but they also kind of flare out laterally. So do we have other questions?
Mostly joke. I think mostly joke questions. So how do we, like, I guess clay to know, but how do we know which dinosaurs inside the clades are like the Stegosaurus branch and Triceratops branches and the sauropod clades? Do you just know them from? I guess that's complicated. We get in the bones, the past bones, and that more genetics like we can nowadays. Is that how we know what this by the bones what clades they were in?
It's primarily the bones. We have some soft tissue data for some groups, but it's very rare that you get much soft tissue from a fossil. Although it's becoming more common as we're learning better how to spot it. So there is that. But yeah, it's primarily based on skeletal characteristics. So we'll say, okay, well, this is a thyreophoran, and you'll say, okay, why? Well, you say, well, it has these bony dermal structures that are characteristic of Thyreophora, whether it be hard scutes or plates along the back or what have you. And then you'll come to this and you'll say, well, this is a Ceratopsian. Well, prove that. And you say, okay, well, it's got a rostral bone and it's got these particular this particular jaw arrangement where it's got this projection of the dentary that up into up above the skull and all these things like that. Or you'll get to like theropods and you'll say, well, I mean, clearly it's a theropod. Look at the feet. It's got the 3 main toes and the dew claw. Look, it's got promaxillary fenestrum, stuff like that. So it's primarily, aspects of the skeleton help us figure this out. And it's really all we have to go on for non-avian dinosaurs because we don't have their genetics. We have very little soft tissue information in general. And it's also not perfect. We can't always resolve the phylogenetics of dinosaurs, non-avian dinosaurs, without a fair few more polytomies than we would like. And a polytomy is basically just where when you have your cladogram or your phylogenetic tree, in cases where you can do those, you can't resolve of 3 or more taxa, which are more closely related, and so they just form a single node with more than 2 descendant branches.
Yeah, but that's why I do wish sometimes that we could get the soft tissue had some of the soft tissue dinosaurs that we can get had some leftover DNA remnants, so we could cross confirm what we know.
Well, one of the problems is scientists like Dr. Mary Schweitzer have in fact found positive results when staining for DNA in some dinosaur fossils. But the problem is it's not in long enough strands that we can actually sequence it. And it also, for that reason, we can't actually prove that it's dinosaur DNA.
It might be like bacterial
right.
DNA.
So, or fungal, or who knows what, right? Because all the stain does is say, oh, if it stains this color, there's DNA in here somewhere. So we're unlikely to ever actually get a non-avian genome sequence. Now, we have done some protein sequences with some recovered molecular artifacts of collagen. And those have been remarkably bird-like. Although there is still some people saying that it might have been contamination at the lab. Maybe. But yeah, we're probably never going to get the genetics of any non-avian dinosaur. But we also have, say Chickensaurus becomes a reality, could we genetically engineer it to give it the velociraptor claw? Almost certainly yes. Or genetically engineer it to get bigger like a T-Rex. The bigger part is a bit tough because in order to get really big, it requires more adaptations than just isometrically growing.
Of course, that we might have to do. I guess maybe for that we might have to do a little. What's the word? Not genetic breed. God, it's a simple word. Oh, artificial selection, maybe.
Even artificial selection might not be great because I mean, just take a look at animals that we've bred to be unusually large, right? So look at Great Danes. They have really bad hip and knee problems. It's just endemic to the breed. It gets really bad. And hip dysplasia is common in many large breeds of dogs.
Well, I guess that's anything where you crossbreed. You start crossbreeding them more closely related, and they get more genetic problems, I guess.
Well, so there's 2 things. There's one is inbreeding, and the other one is that unlike natural selection, artificial selection tends to ignore things that isn't in the scope of what the selectors are focused on. So if I say I want the biggest dog possible, if these dogs are later in life having their cartilage in their knee just wear completely out and they're getting hip dysplasia, that doesn't stop me from breeding the largest ones together.
Yeah, we we do more what we like to look at and stuff. We're natural selection, like how they better survive out in the wild.
Yeah, so it's I don't think we could, in a reasonable amount of time, like any one person could live to see it, get from a chicken-sized Chickensaurus to a T-Rex-sized Chickensaurus. Could it eventually happen? Yes, but I think the resulting animal would not be very healthy, and I would suggest that we not do it, for the same reason that I don't think we should continue to breed brachycephalic dogs. If it were up to me, every pug would be neutered.
Is that the one of the flat nose and stuff?
Yeah. Look, I get it. They're cute and they're fun, and I have met plenty of pugs that I liked too. However, if it were up to me, animals that are that poorly built as a result of human breeding should all be sterilized. They shouldn't be killed.
Or at least maybe breed them with more long-nosed dogs that try to get their noses.
Maybe, but many of them can't actually breed naturally anyway.
Like, I lost my train of thought now. Okay. My other before question is, so the theropods and the sauropods are more branched together, most likely.
Unless Ornithoscelida is the accurate hypothesis.
As far as we know right now in the science we know now. So,
well, that's the thing. It's not entirely clear if the Ornithoscelida hypothesis is correct. So the conventional answer to the question would be yes, sauropods and theropods are more closely related to each other than they are to ornithischians. But that's currently a bit up in the air. I tend to say yes, I think so, but I can't say that with huge amounts of confidence.
Well, what really have to think about science. I guess we do a lot of stuff. But, it can change. It can new information can come out. And
right. Well, that's one of the great things about science is when science finds out that some conclusion in science seems to be wrong or at least incomplete. Science is like, well, okay, we'll switch on that one. So that's one of the reasons why when the Ornithoscelida paper was published, it wasn't just dismissed. People engaged with it. There were people who said, okay, well, that's unusual. Let's try to do follow-up studies. Let's try to get a hold of their data. What happens if we add in more taxa? What happens if we select a different sampling of taxa? What if we weight characters differently? Do we still get the same results? And the answer was sometimes. So, yeah. Like any field of science.
Ongoing process.
Yeah. Paleontology is an ongoing process. And because data points are so hard to come by in paleontology, you just have to kind of rely on luck to some extent. It's always going to be, there's always going to be up in the air things, but we've also come a long way since even just 20, 30 years ago. Like 30 years ago, no one thought that we would ever know anything about what color a dinosaur was. And we now have pretty decent color data for a number of dinosaurs.
Yeah. And this is before other podcasts about dinosaurs and stuff, but I did not know that the asteroid hypothesis or theory was so recent. Like when I was growing up in the 80s, it was still, and I found it yet, but now I think I thought it was always a thing. It was until like the late 80s, early 90s.
So it wasn't as well supported until then. It had been one of the ideas floated around as a possible explanation for a while. But it wasn't until then that they actually, the crater in the Yucatan was actually found complete with, all the shock quartz, and it was correlated with the, now I'm blanking on the name of the element. Iridium. The iridium, spike.
Layer?
Yeah, at the KT boundary. And then there were the shock quartz and the iridium layer are the big things that solidified this, along with finding an actual impact crater and noting that globally instances of shock quartz and iridium get higher the closer you get to the crater. And the fact that, sorry, in places where the KPG boundary is clearly visible, which is not everywhere, but in places where it is, it correlates very tightly with this iridium layer. And that was sort of the nail in the coffin. Now, other things were going on at the time. There was some flood basalt eruptions around that same time in India. And I think also some in Russia. And so it was already not a great time.
Yeah, I heard that at least that I don't know the rest of the world, at least in North America, where the crater had the most impact, at least the impact had the most the impact had the most impact. That dinosaurs were already kind of like not as diverse as they used to be.
Well, it's a little iffy. There seems to be less diversity in the fossil record in the late Cretaceous than there had been earlier, but another problem is that might just be because there was less fossilization happening, which is one of the things we always have to be careful about in the fossil record, right? Because you don't find something doesn't mean it wasn't there.
Yeah, kind of like Eric mentioned that too, where on the human side was more arid, we had more fossilization of the human side brands, but on the chimp bonobo brands where it was more jungle-like, it was harder to get fossils.
Right. Another example would be if you look at the Morrison Formation, which is where you find animals like Stegosaurus, Ceratosaurus, Allosaurus, stuff like that. There's virtually no small animals and very few herbivores, but they must have been there. But the Morrison Formation is really bad at preserving small bones. So there would have been a lot of stuff that existed in the actual paleo environment that is currently, shown to us in the Morrison Formation, but we just don't know for certain what those animals were.
That's speaking of Allosaurus, Stegosaurus, and all that, those like that. Another thing about the Jurassic Park movie series, like it was, they at least as far as I know, they had very few Jurassic dinosaurs.
Yeah, so Jurassic dinosaurs in Jurassic Park, you got Stegosaurus, you've got Allosaurus, Ceratosaurus, and Brachiosaurus, and I think that's basically it. Pretty much everything else in there is Cretaceous. So you got the Parasaurolophus, you got the Gallimimus, the T-Rex, the Velociraptor. Oh, Dilophosaurus is Jurassic as well.
I guess Jurassic was just more catchy. Park was just more catchy than.
Yeah, that's exactly it. In fact, actually, in the book, someone mentions that, and the Mr. Hammond in the book says, "Oh, I know, but Jurassic Park is a better name for a theme park." And it's like, okay.
Yeah, I skimmed through the book once. Thing that's like, I think in the book they switched place. The grandkids switched places or something like that.
I don't remember exactly. Yeah.
The boy was the computer genius instead of the girl.
Like I said,
yeah,
I won't dispute it. I just don't remember very clearly. So Eric Vierthaler asks, what is your favorite dinosaur? Meleagris. Most underrated dinosaur. That's tough. Eric says that his is Megalosaurus is vastly underrated. It was the first dinosaur ever scientifically classified. So my thing with Megalosaurus is that it's cool enough, but like ultimately it's kind of generic. Like it's cool that it was the first, or it's essentially tied for first with Iguanodon. But like I don't know, it just there's not much about it as an animal that stands out to me compared to, say, Carcharodontosaurus or T-Rex or Velociraptor, as it actually was. Like, all these have a thing, and Megalosaurus is just kind of like, I'm a theropod, guys. It's like, yep, that's true. So let's see. Most underrated dino. I'm actually just going to go ahead and go back to like the Alvarezsaurids. Like, Mononychus needs more love, guys. Give Alvarezsaurus or Mononicus some love out there. They're really cool, and they're adorable. But let's see what else. I think people just point and laugh at E. It's a much cooler dinosaur than I think people are actually giving it credit for. So there's that. But I also think that some animals are a bit overrated. Like, I think Triceratops is a little bit overrated as far as like ceratopsians go. There were some really cool ceratopsians over there, and when it comes to late ceratopsians, Triceratops is just kind of there.
Oh, by the way, got my glasses on. I had these for my 1-year-old niece's Zoom birthday party.
Oh, fun!
Yeah, my niece turned 1 Saturday. So far I've only met her via FaceTime or Zoom because of the thing. Unfortunately.
Yeah. Well, that's our current time, son.
Yeah. Off topic again. I saw this funny little clip on Facebook or whatever. But this like when you grow up in the COVID era, this little toddler girl was pretending everything was a hand sanitizer and she was wiping her hands.
Oh man. Ugh. I'm lucky. I bought 4 liters of hand sanitizer before the whole COVID thing even happened.
Yeah, me not sanitizer, but it's funny. About a few months before the lockdown happened, I was at a bulk store, Sam's Club, with my one of my other nieces, more grown up one, but it's a late birthday present. Like here, have some a big bucket of toilet paper. Okay, my cool. And then a few weeks later, that's when the whole toilet paper craze happened. So I already.
Oh goodness, that thing was stupid.
So I was already pre-prepared before it happened. Didn't even know about it. So as we go, yeah. So you've done this before. You've had a lot of debates about this topic, but now we're getting closer to the bird side of the dinosaurs. That's necessarily closely in the theropod section, right?
Yes, birds are definitely theropods. So as we go down, they are tetanurans. So that is a group of theropods that emerges in the early Jurassic. It means stiff tails, and they're characterized by, in the earlier members, stiff ligaments going between the vertebrae of the tail that help stiffen it. And then later, more derived tetanurans that starts to ossify into hard, bony elements. And then in birds, they actually take it to the point where they shorten and fuse the vertebrae at the distal end of the tail into what's called a pegastyle. Then, more specifically, they're allosauroid tetanurans, so they're closer to Allosaurus than they are to Ceratosaurus. Then within that, I mean, there's a bunch of these, but they're in the Coelurosaur group. Now, originally, Coelurosaurs were just kind of defined as the small theropods. That's no longer the case. We now have actually some pretty solid evidence as to who Coelurosaurs were and weren't. And some of the large theropods were Coelurosaurs, like T-Rex. But T-Rex is on a very different branch of the Coelurosauria than birds are. So you getting closer to birds, you're getting Maniraptorans, which means hand snatchers. And these are all animals that had this musculature and limb anatomy where they were able to reach out with their forelimbs, grab objects, and then clutch them up against their body. This is primarily for prey restraint. So then you get into the Eumaniraptorans, which is a slightly smaller group that excludes a few things, like I think ornithomimids or something. Maybe ornithochirids too. But then now you're getting into things like Paravian animals and the dromaeosaurids and the troodontids. So that's sort of Deinonychosauria. Then, so there's been a little bit of debate as to exactly how Deinonychosauria and Paravians kind of fit together. And there have been some arguments that Paravians are actually Deinonychosaurians. That's not currently where the majority of researchers are leaning. Most researchers would say that Deinonychosauria and aves split away from each other before the split within Deinonychosauria between troodontids and dromaeosaurs.
So where did your branch off?
Remember way back over at Allosauroidea?
Yeah.
The other group is Ceratosauroidea. And the ceratosauroids lead primarily the biggest group they lead to Carcharodontosaurs and the group that includes everyone's favorite Carnotaurus, and I'm having trouble thinking the name of it.
So are theropods the main branch that didn't go back to bipedalism?
Oh yeah, the common ancestor of all theropods was almost certainly a biped.
I mean, but I think maybe some on the other branch didn't go back. Some doesn't go back. They stayed bipedal too, but like so a lot of them went back to quadrupedal branches. Like sauropods did. The Stegosaurus branch there.
And is it Belosaurus? That was the group to which Carnotaurus belongs. Sorry, I couldn't remember it. So theropods don't really have, as far as I know, any really quadrupedal members. For some time, it was thought that maybe Spinosaurus might have been a quadruped. And I've actually had the discussion as to whether or not a quadrupedal dinosaur was reasonable. Or sorry, not dinosaur, theropod was like something that could have existed. And I get a lot of people who say no and then don't give a good reason. And the best reason I've heard is that the arms are too inflexible. And then I just point out, okay, but none of the actual workers in the field, and because this is usually a discussion that I'm having with people who aren't quite professionals, and I point out, no one objected to the quadruped Spinosaurus for biomechanical problems. It was just lack of evidence, and it would be kind of weird. And so I don't think there was anything that could have prevented it. But one of the things is that basically for the entire group of theropods, they always maintained relatively predatory niches, which if you look at the quadrupedal dinosaurs, one of the things they all have in common is they're primarily herbivores. They are being quadrupeds because their gigantic guts, they need to eat plants and digest plants properly, shifts the balance of or the point of balance or the center of mass.
I guess when you're herbivores, I guess running to catch your prey of plants isn't that necessary.
Right. Yeah. The plants aren't going to run away from you. And most of some herbivorous dinosaurs like ornithopods and heterodontosaurids, who might or might not be ornithopods, while they didn't maintain a very swift build and the ability to run fast, many others settled on just being gigantic and unpleasant to mess with. So, for example, that's your things like your ceratopsians, your sauropods, your thyreophorans like stegosaurids and ankylosaurids and stuff like that.
So they either grew armor protections or they grew supersized,
or both in some cases. We actually have armored titanosaurs. So there's even at least one sauropod that had a clubbed tail similar to an ankylosaurus, although it was derived differently. So it's only superficially like an ankylosaurus.
But speaking of growing size in the hollow bones, was that deep in the Archosaur branch or more on the dinosaur pterosaur side?
No, that's deep into Archosauria. We have a lot of so the process of sort of extensions of the respiratory system invading a bone is called invagination. We have a lot of that skeletal invagination in Archosaurs going on both sides of the Pseudosuchi and Avaminosaurus split. Now, it ends up being more extensive in dinosaurs and pterosaurs than it was in most other Archosaurs, but it is definitely something that is pretty deep in Archosauria.
And that's basically why that their side of the family can grow a lot bigger than like the mammal side with the more solid bones.
That's part of it. Another part is just also that the respiratory system in Archosaurs is much more efficient. So
I guess, and plus the fact that they are still egg laying and live birth kind of bigger things kind of takes a little bit longer.
Well, It's not as much of an advantage as you would think, because so let's say you lay an egg, right? That egg needs to physically contain enough food to bring that embryo to term, which means you have a much bigger upfront cost. So, for instance, if you're going to be pregnant, you don't need to have all the food to bring a baby to term right there with you. You can continue to eat and supplement the growing embryos with your current diet as you're going. So there's that. Also, one of the things is that this means that even some of the largest dinosaurs laid relatively small eggs. So, for instance, a sauropod egg generally wasn't much larger than, say, like an ostrich egg, even though a sauropod is going to grow up to be huge compared to an ostrich.
Is that related?
As a juvenile, you're going to be pretty darn vulnerable compared to an adult.
Is that why why you see people talking about how they brought baby dinosaurs on the ark?
Yeah, that is basically why, and I get it. It does help with the space problem. It doesn't solve the space problem, but it helps. But another problem that you get is that babies generally have a much higher metabolism just so that they can grow. So pound for pound, they actually eat a lot more. And in the space of a year, a sauropod is going to grow a lot. So even if you bring on an egg, you're going to need a very, very large enclosure for your baby sauropods by the end of a year plus at sea.
I guess plus I think the main problem of that is either babies or eggs. How they say that there's genetically inclined, like most babies, unless they're like one of the things that don't have parents. But dinosaurs, since dinosaurs are more like birds, I guess that they maybe they do herds or something. But like how are they gonna teach their babies what to do growing up unless like one of the independent animals?
Well, we know that many dinosaurs had extensive parental care, and for those species, that would be a problem. You don't get to learn how to be a member of your species if you don't grow up with other members of it. But on the other hand, there probably were many dinosaurs that didn't really have extensive parental care. Sauropods probably among them. So it is, yeah. And actually, you can get this problem with animals today. So for instance, sometimes people will adopt a little baby chimpanzee and raise it more like a human baby than a chimpanzee. And almost every single time, they end up giving this animal up to some, ape sanctuary because, quite frankly, you cannot handle a post-pubescent chimpanzee in your house. It could very well kill you. Like, it's not the kind of animal that you want in your house. I know it looks cute and tiny and adorable as a baby, and it acts a lot like a human toddler for a long time. But once those hormones kick in, yeah, it's going to be a bad time. If you think having a teenager in the house is destructive and annoying, try a chimpanzee teenager. It's going to be a lot worse. And they're going to be strong enough to literally rip your face off. So, but then unfortunately, those chimpanzees have trouble getting along with other chimpanzees because they never learned how to. They've never learned how to socialize with members of their own species. Now, it's an extreme example with primates because so much of primate behavior is learned. But it still occurs with other things. For instance, sometimes you'll get birds who end up being primarily raised by something outside their species, especially in domestic settings, right? Like people will hand raise chickens or ducklings or whatever. Or sometimes you can get weird situations like a chicken will adopt some ducklings. Mm. And they tend to have trouble with intraspecific interactions because they weren't socialized within their original species. So yeah, this would be a problem. But actually, it was a theme in Jurassic Park. It was a theme in the book that didn't come across in the movie. Is that even if you clone a dinosaur and you have a population of these dinosaurs, they have not been properly socialized to be members of whatever species that is.
Yeah, that's right. I guess that's the thing between between instinct and race behavior. Like would that duck know that water they can float on, they can go on water if the chicken mom, or they not even go near water?
Generally, ducks that are raised by not ducks still do have an affinity for water, and they'll just naturally seek it out. That seems to be instinctual. But where they'll have trouble is trying to socialize with other ducks.
Yeah, kind of like how the sea turtles, they naturally go to the water after they hatch.
Yeah, they're drawn. and actually they're not even drawn to by water. What they're actually mostly drawn by is light, and they actually the timing of when they're born actually usually corresponds to moon phases and where the moon is going to be on the horizon. And that's actually one of the problems with modern beaches is that city lights often draw sea turtles in the wrong direction. And so there have been a number of attempts to try to fix this. For instance, I know in Hawaii there have been a few attempts to get people to turn out the lights in various buildings, even like big buildings, around the time that the turtles are predicted to be hatching. I've heard of some people putting up large like vertical sheets of black fabric or wood or something like that to try to shade the beach so that the sea turtles start going towards the ocean. So yeah, it's also sort of like when insects swarm around a light. It's because they usually use the moon to navigate, and a light which is so close by and so much brighter confuses them. It short circuits their navigational systems basically. So yeah, there are instincts, and it is going to be virtually impossible to get an animal away from its instincts. But there are also learned behaviors that most animals have, or at least most amniotes have. I mean, certain things are much more like a pre-programmed robot. So, like
you get more on the amphibian and chordate side.
Well, I mean, amniotes are chordates, but
that's what I mean. But yeah.
Yeah. So it seems like amphibians don't do as much socializing, and their calls seem to be mostly instinctive. In fact, they're so instinctive that the mating calls of some frogs is the only way to distinguish between species. And even when they're not raised among other conspecifics, they'll still maintain the characteristic mating call of their species. But that's not true for mating calls in birds. Mating calls in birds don't correspond very tightly with genetics. And in fact, if you take a bird from one region to another region and raise it there amongst other birds of the same species, it will grow up with the local accent, if you will. Just like if you take, if someone is born in China but comes to, say, the United States at the age of 1, when they grow up speaking English, they're not going to have a Chinese accent, even though their parents probably will.
Yeah, I heard that's the best time to teach a baby, teach people languages is when they're still in the infant or toddler stages.
Yeah, that's really true for social behaviors for a lot of species. The younger that you start out socializing with members of your own species, the better off you're going to do in social settings with members of your species. And that's especially important for social species, which we know many dinosaurs were.
So I guess if you want your kids to be fluent in multi-languages, teach them when they're still talk that language when they're still young.
Well, it's tricky actually. Kids resist learning multiple languages if they can.
Okay.
So, like for instance, if they notice that their peers all speak, say, English, right? Because this is a common phenomenon in a lot of countries. And their parents only speak a certain language at home, but they notice that their parents actually do speak English because maybe their parents use English at the shop or whatever. The kids may, in fact, start refusing to use whatever language the parents want them to use at home.
Okay.
And or if they notice that some people have tried to do it where one parent will only speak one language to the child and only accept responses in that language, and the other parent will only speak another language to the child and only accept responses in that language. But then when they talk to each other, they'll usually default to one of those two languages. The child will usually default to that language and will start, now often, this is not universal, but may start to refuse the other language that they've decided that is not the one that the parents use between each other. Because it's a lot more work to learn two languages simultaneously than it is one.
Sure. I was gonna ask if you ever had kids, are you gonna teach your kids both English and Klingon?
I very much doubt it. I don't see, I don't see much point in having a kid learn Klingon. Actually, there was someone who tried to get his kid to grow up as a multilingual with Klingon as one of the languages, and he actually did use the technique of he only addressed and accepted responses in Klingon from the child, while the mother used English. And while the child did start to learn Klingon and was able to use it, it was very clear that he did not like using the language.
Yeah.
And eventually he started refusing to respond in Klingon, and then essentially forgot the language. Although it was a bit early to try that experiment anyway. At the time the experiment was done, which I believe was like the mid-90s, there really wasn't all that much in the way of vocabulary. Like at that point, Klingon didn't have a word for table. And it's like, come on, how are you going to try and talk to your kid and there's not even a word for table?
It was still a basic language at that point, I guess.
Yeah, so we've had a lot more vocabulary come in the decades since, because the guy who created the language, Mark Okrand, is still very active in the community of people who learn Klingon, and he takes requests for new words periodically.
But so back to dinosaurs and birds.
Right.
Off topic there, but so was it in the Jurassic time or the Cretaceous time that birds fully became not say a separate clade, but more of its own little division?
So birds are definitely around from the Middle Jurassic. Now, the birds that were around in the Middle Jurassic weren't a whole lot like the birds that we see now. Maya says, I have a lot of friends that don't speak their native language. They understand it perfectly, but when asked, will usually say they don't think the grammar is good in that other language. So I think you might mean because the native language usually refers to your first language. It's the one that you speak most commonly, but I think I get what you mean. Like, when they grew up in a Spanish-speaking house or something, and they primarily speak English, and they try not to speak a lot of Spanish. That's actually fairly common in language. There's this thing called the expressive-receptive gap. You're always able to understand more than you're able to express in any given language, and that's even true for your native language usually. And part of that is just like inferences, like recognizing root words and affixes and stuff that you recognize when they're coming in, but you don't know them already in your brain as a lexical term that you can then pull up and use. And the same thing is going to be true for grammar, right? Like the nuances of grammar might not matter that much in understanding the gist of a sentence. So for instance, if you're primarily an English speaker and someone speaks to you, say, in Spanish, you're probably not going to pick up on the exact semantic difference between, say, like the subjunctive and the declarative moods. But you'll probably still get the gist of the sentence. But then when you try to produce similar sentences, you will probably screw up which mood to use because you're not super clear on the distinction. Because it's a distinction that English rarely makes and only makes in the most formal registers. But I tend to have a formal way of speaking, so sometimes I use the subjunctive mood where other people wouldn't. But anyway, so we get birds in the Jurassic, and by the Cretaceous, especially the late Cretaceous, many of them are, you could look at them and you would recognize them as members of modern groups. So for instance, we have both ground and waterfowl at the end Cretaceous. So you would look at something and you would say, well, that looks like a grouse or a ptarmigan or something like that. Or look at something else and be like, well, that kind of looks like a goose. In fact, you'd probably just say that's probably just a goose.
And and some, it wasn't like all one clade, but it happened in several different branches, I guess, where they lost their ability to fly.
Yeah, flightlessness has evolved numerous times in birds. So the common ancestor of all birds would have been a flighted animal. It would have been able to fly. Probably not as well as most modern birds. It probably was more morphologically similar to like the tinamou, which is the only paleognath bird that still flies. And it's not a very good flyer. It has only a weakly keeled sternum, and its downstroke as a result is just not that powerful.
That's a thing on a lot of animals, that they go from one to the other to back again, like from the water to land, back to water again, from quad to bi to quad again, then from ground to flying back to ground again.
Yeah, although some transitions are more difficult than others. Going from not flying to flying is difficult. That's why it's only happened 4 times. Whereas going from flying to not flying happens all the time. So one of the things is flight is expensive. It takes a lot of energy to lift your mass off the ground. And I don't care what you do to try and optimize that. It's still going to be a very costly activity. So if you don't need it, it's actually pretty advantageous to get rid of it.
This is why a lot of island birds lose that ability.
Because there's not as heavy a predation selection. So when you don't need flight to escape from predators, and you don't really need it to find food because there's plenty, it just kind of makes sense to get rid of flight, because it's just so expensive to maintain the gigantic muscles and even the brain power. Like, a huge portion of a bird's brain is taken up with things like balance and being able to sight and see what level is, and sensory data from the wings and the feathers that give information about exact how much trim it should have and the exact shape its wings should take at this particular time. And they're making these tiny little micro adjustments and exactly how extended their wing are all the time, combined with the flapping and all of this. And if you don't need that, it actually makes a lot of sense to just chuck it. So that's why you get dodos, which are just pigeons that can't fly, or were pigeons that can't fly.
Oh, speaking of birds, dinosaurs and stuff, so were they branched off on the side, the theropod side of the dinosaurs, when their arms were, I guess I would say more useful, but I say how dinosaur arms like that. I'll say they're useless, but I'm trying to say this. Maybe they had longer arms.
So birds belong to a group of theropods called Maniraptorans, which means hand snatchers, and they actually had very robust forelimbs that actually had a lot of the same articulation that modern birds use for flapping. So the same motion with the arm that say a velociraptor or something like that would use to spring forward with its claws and clamp down on prey and then pull it up to the body is essentially the same motion that a bird uses for flapping. So first the arms come up and out and they splay out to the sides, and then they close down rapidly, and then they pull back as the elbow and the wrist both articulate to, a closed position. And then if it misses, then the animal tries it again. So the arms come out and back and up again. And so the only thing birds are really doing they're just extending the vertical range of that upstroke. And so, yeah, they're actually descended from very, very forelimb dominant animals. And also, Eric asked me what made me choose a Ceratosaurus as my avatar. It's the fanciest dinosaur of the Morrison Formation, and that's pretty much it.
They were the rich dinosaurs apparently, because they were the hats and stuff.
Yep.
So I guess on the South American island for a long time, the dinosaurs were still the top predators.
Actually, there have been a lot of places where dinosaurs remain top predators for a really long time. For instance, in South America, dinosaurs remain the dominant predators up until well into the Cenozoic. The terror birds were the dominant predators in South America until
because they were more isolated. I guess that South American island. Before the North American crash. Yeah,
basically. And also, dinosaurs remain very high-end predators in a lot of environments. I mean, look at eagles. Very few things predate on eagles. What's eating eagles? I mean, basically nothing. They're essentially apex predators. Now, they're not killing the same game as mammalian apex predators like lions or wolves or something, but they're still basically at the top of the food chain.
I got the thing go, but all right. So tomorrow, you want to advertise your show for tomorrow?
Yeah, sure. So tomorrow at 6 p.m. my time, which is 5 p.m. Pacific, 8 p.m. Eastern, I'm going to be doing Kent with Bent. Kent with Bent is my regular Tuesday show. It happens basically the same time every week, except second Tuesdays in the month, where I do Eric with Erica with Guts at Gibbon. Again, at the same time, though. And so, yeah, we just basically point and laugh at Kent Hovind. And basically, Kent Hovind is so dumb that I can debunk him without much effort while playing a drinking game that usually ends with me being reasonably drunk.
With your eyes closed and one hand tied behind your back.
Yeah, basically. It's Ken Hovind is he's such low tier that it takes virtually no effort to debunk everything he says while drinking. So if you were to cast Lion King with dinosaurs, what dinosaurs would you cast as the characters? That's So I'm not sure actually, because one of the things is that I would want to know, do I have to keep it to a specific time period? Does it have to be just dinosaurs? So I think a better question would be, if I had to put the Lion King in a different time period, what would I cast? And one of the problems is that the whole idea of a pride of lions, where you have this tight social cohesion with a strict hierarchy, it's not clear that there were any dinosaurs like that. We don't really have any good evidence of pack hunting, because a pride of lions is just a pack. I mean, let's face it. So we have evidence that sometimes conspecifics would mob a prey item. So, for instance, we have instances where it seems like allosaurs from multiple directions would all mob onto a single sauropod, but it's not clear that this was coordinated. It might just have been opportunistic. Like, there's a bunch of allosaurus in the area, and they notice one is going for a sauropod, and they figure, I'll do it too. As opposed to forming permanent packs that have coordination. So you get that problem where, what is a good analog for a lion, which is a highly social apex predator? And I don't know that there is one in dinosaurs.
Yeah. You mentioned that. So it reminds me of a video I saw where I guess this coyote took down a deer or something, or this kind of thing, and it was eating it. Then this wolf came along, got the coyote and the deer both for dinner.
Yeah, wolves will kill coyotes. They are not fans of coyotes. But the other thing is, coyotes will raid unprotected wolf dens. So despite the fact that they're very close related and they can interbreed, Canis lupus and Canis latrans do not get on very well.
Yeah. When apparently before when they got rid of the wolves in the Yosemite maybe area, the coyotes, once the wolves were gone, the coyotes took over.
Yeah, that's actually happening throughout a lot of the United States, where the wolves have been largely killed off. For instance, I have family in Massachusetts, and when I was a kid and I was growing up in Massachusetts, we didn't have coyotes. They have coyotes now. So,
because the main predators were gone.
Yeah, they basically humans just devastated wolf populations throughout North America, and coyotes couldn't fill in that area as fast as the wolves were dying. But now that they're mostly gone throughout most of North America, coyotes are spreading in, because if you leave a niche vacant, it will be filled. And interestingly, the eastern coyotes that we're getting in the eastern United States are not exactly the same as the western coyotes that you get in like near where I live, like in New Mexico, Arizona, and places like that. The eastern coyotes actually have significant amounts of Canis lupus DNA, both from wolves and dogs. And so they're larger and they're less afraid of humans in the east.
And we can talk about this
more dangerous.
We'll talk about this next thing, but it might the dinosaur thing. Talk about. I wonder how that happened in the dinosaur area, where there was a mini predator and then a more top predator. And if the top predator's away, the mini predator ooh, it's my land now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, you see it all over the place. The same thing will happen basically anywhere where a big predator is gone. And a lot of times it happens as a result of humans. Humans do not like big predators in their territory for understandable reasons. They mess with your livestock. They might eat you.
Yeah. But I guess what they don't know is, with the big predator gone, the little predator is oh, they become the threat. They become the threat then.
I think now we realize that. But sometimes it's worth it. Like England doesn't have really native predators much larger than foxes, right? And my guess is that if you were to ask a medieval peasant whether or not he would rather have a place that's full of wolves that could hunt his sheep versus a place that's full of foxes that can only really hunt his chickens, he would choose the foxes over the wolves.
Yeah. And did you hear about the trying to breed the foxes like dog program?
The silver foxes in Russia. Yeah. Also, I got this might So that was a cool experiment. It was actually done for the fur trade. The idea was supposed to be, let's get some tame foxes that will be easy to raise for fur, much like minks. So minks are a species of mustelid. They're sort of semi-aquatic. They're not quite as aquatic as most otters are, but they really like to swim. But they're also okay at climbing trees, like most weasels are. But there's a semi-domesticated variety of mink that is tamer, that is used in the fur trade. And so this idea was in Russia. We're like, hey, let's do the same thing with the red fox, with the silver morph, because the silver fur is valuable. It's more valuable than the red fur. So yeah, they were actually able to very quickly induce a lot of changes that made them tamer, but also interestingly had a lot of genetic parallels to the way that dogs are distinct from wolves. So for instance, a lot of these foxes ended up with like floppy ears or curled tails, things like that. They also retain more juvenile features like dogs do compared to wolves.
Which makes you,
but also tended to ruin the fur.
Yeah, that's what side effect. It was makes you think. I know that they did different things, but with like not COVID evolution, convey. I keep forgetting the words, simple words. Congruent evolution, convergent evolution. If they can ever make like Great Dane type foxes or Chihuahua type foxes.
I mean, hypothetically, one of the problems though is that, so if you look at laws, there's a really strong status quo bias with what's legal and what's illegal, right? So for instance, if caffeine were discovered today, that stuff would be super illegal. Instead, we don't even have an age limit on it.
Cool. I mean,
5-year-old caffeine, and no one really cares.
Yeah. My podcast will be an underground podcast right now. And
so one of the things is, though, that similarly, laws about what animals you can and can't keep are based on what animals were basically reasonable pets 500 years ago. And so in most places, foxes are not classified as animals that you can keep as pets. Most places have rules against keeping wild animals, and foxes count even if they're domesticated because the law doesn't care.
Yeah.
So one of the problems with the fox becoming a new common pet is that it's illegal in a lot of places to own a domesticated fox, even if it is legitimately one of these domesticated foxes that is fully domesticated and no less tame than, an actual dog. So I don't think we're going to get those, but I do think that I will answer Eric's question, and I think that'll be the last one because I got to get going.
Yeah, I was gonna say. I remember my question first of all. It reminded me of, you reminded me of your tweet yesterday about grazing things about GMOs. How we took the pigs, the cows, and the corn from yesteryear to what we have now.
Yeah. Modern pigs are just domesticated boars, and boars do not much look or act like domesticated pigs. So the same thing for corn. It's descended from the wild teosinte grass, and they are very different organisms now. And yeah, so we've been genetically modifying our food organisms for tens of thousands of years. It's not new. It's just now faster and more targeted.
And how close are you to your 50th episode of Kent with Bent?
We're on 49 tomorrow.
Wow. So next week is the big 5-0.
Yep. So let's see. Am I a fan of Walking with Dinosaurs? Generally, yes. Of course, it has not aged super well. The special effects are now kind of they're just not aging super well, and also some of the reconstructions we now know are a bit off. And in fact, the Allosaurus was terrible. The Allosaurus in Walking with Dinosaurs was actually a worse reconstruction than the Jurassic Park Allosaurus, which is not normally you cannot say that Jurassic Park had a better reconstruction of anything than any documentary, but it's actually the case for the Allosaurus. But generally speaking, yeah, it was a lot of fun. I still have a lot of nostalgia for that series. I still watch it every few years or so.
I prefer the Walking with Monsters.
That was also fun.
Anyways, thanks for being on here. Thanks for all the chat people. Eric, Ian, James, Maya, even I guess even Kenny for being in the chat. But anyways, go to the Dapper channel tomorrow, same time. You want
Same bat time, different bat channel.
Yep. As we look closer to 50, as I always say, never stop learning. Enjoy the randomness. We'll see y'all next time. Bye.